Good evening. This is Rhonda from Hamden Action Now. So tonight we have a really great community conversation with Stephen Winter. He's the 21st Ward Alder in New Haven, which is adjacent to Hamden in the Newhallville section. And I'm really excited to meet him and talk with him and find out what his legislative priorities are for his ward. So stay tuned. We'll be right back in a few, and we'll be looking forward to having this really interesting and awesome conversation tonight with Steve Winter.
Let's go! Ho, ho!
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Cool. So I saw you. I know you saw our 5th district councilman, Justin Farmer, at the end of that intro video, which is really cool. He was on last night. He's your neighbor.
and a hero of democracy. We are all better off for having come in contact with Justin Farmer each time we come in contact with Justin Farmer.
Isn't it totally cool? I mean, he's just such a rebel for justice, and I just love it. So I'm so happy to meet you tonight and find out what the legislative priorities are for the 21st Ward, and that you're the alder of our neighbor alder. So I would love to hear that, because it all kind of, even though, there's this town boundary and whatnot, but it all kind of is the same. I know that lately there's been a lot of, crime and things, and I know that's gotten worse since the pandemic. So we would love to hear more about that.
Absolutely. I mean, on crime, the city held its first Project Longevity call-in, where they're partnering with state and federal task force members on Project Longevity to try to identify folks who are most at risk of committing gun violence. And I think we need to see that again and again to make sure that for folks who might be close to committing a crime, that they're given really clear alternatives and paths to better things to be doing. Right? We all want to be looking at that kind of restorative justice, and it's a model we know works. And I really wish that call-in had happened sooner, because so many people have been left without in-person visits from parole officers and the other kind of support that we saw pre-COVID. I think that's a huge part of it, and a huge part of the uptick in violence that we're seeing.
Yeah, the support, just everybody had to stay home. Everybody just basically, from like March until probably the summer. I mean, I don't think I left the house more than like 4 times, and till like July, and then all of a sudden, the George Floyd situation happened, and then we all had to just go out. So I can only imagine. It's so funny. I always wanted to ask you. So what's up with the plowing? That's always seems to be like, we've been really blessed the last couple of years. We haven't had a lot of snow, but I always hear everybody. And then I rode over beyond on Dixwell Avenue last week, and I was like, this is like, so what's up with that? I mean, I was curious.
Wow. The plowing has
I go right to the plowing.
It's been something else this year. I think that the big storm we had, I just think that it was huge. Like it overloaded the system. And I was getting calls from people everywhere saying like, I can't even come close to catching the bus. One woman on Goff Street sent me a picture of about like 30 feet of snow between her and where she was, between the curb and where she's supposed to get on the bus. And that's this weird part of Goff Street where it gets really wide, like wide enough you could land an airplane. And the city can normally at least get a little bit closer. So we had to call them. And then eventually it took them a couple days because they were busy like clearing out the road. But eventually they did push all that snow back. But we had to get them over there twice. The craziest snow-related issue that I've dealt with is there's this little street in the ward, West Gibb Street. It's the tiniest street in the ward. and we've been having issues getting it plowed out. We'd call again. There's a lady who lives on that street who's in the nursing field. So she works nights. So it's kind of a good thing for me as the alderperson because she's more patient. She's not calling first thing. She's like, hey, let's give them the day to figure this out. But as the sun starts to set, she's worried about how am I going to get to work?
Right.
And the city was really slow. I live right around the corner on Dixwell. And so I could see plows coming over. And then instead of going down West Gibbs, they're going down Gibbs. And so the previous storms, we finally worked that out. We're like, no, you've got to go that way to get to West Gibbs. But they didn't come down. And in talking to the city administration about this, they're saying, hey, this little street isn't actually a street. Even though it has street lamps, city street lamps, and one of the little green signs, right, says West Gibbs Street, right?
Right, I've seen it.
It's not actually a street. And it looks like, we're not done with the research on this, but it looks like they may be right, that it is like sort of like glorified driveway. But
oh my God,
they've plowed it in the past, right? And they have street lamps on it. And we have 5 families that depend on this little tiny street to get to work, to get to school, to do everything that we do. So that's something that we've got to get to the bottom of, and we got to figure out how to, make sure that these folks get plowed out, right?
Yeah.
So it gets
really, really weird.
Really weird.
It's not on any map anywhere, right? So it's not on the route. It's not on the plow route, sort of.
Oh boy, you asked a tough question.
I'm sorry.
So it is on the map. Well, it's on some of the maps. It's on the engineering map. It's on the city plan map. It's on the map that shows the trash pickup routes for the city, but it's not on the parcel map of like the actual like distribution of all the property lines and everything. It shows that it's on someone's private property.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So that's
wow.
But I think a big problem we had in Newhallville, and I've raised this and haven't really gotten an answer yet, was like we had that storm, and then normally with a really big storm like that, you might see trash pickup delayed a day, right? To give people time to like figure all that out, move some snow around, put their bins out. But that was another source of frustration. It's like it snows. They've got 16 inches of snow on the ground. Everyone's trying to shovel out. And then the next morning, people or the trash truck rolls by. That really didn't make sense to me. It's like nobody's going to have time or even think about it to get their bins out. And so we had calls related to that. Like, hey, my trash didn't get picked up. And we worked with Public Works to get as many of those resolved as we could. So a lot of time on the phone on Henry Street, we had a whole block where like the bins are brimming, they're overflowing, and there's still a lot out there, right, that we need to get to. And so hopefully we can continue working. If I'm given a specific location, I'm going to make sure that those bins get picked up. But this is like the nitty gritty local government stuff, right? This is
well, this is the reason why we try to get everybody to understand how important. I know everybody gets all excited about the presidential election, and it is exciting, but we have to get everybody excited about, municipal. I mean, because this is about your trash collection, your snow plowing, potholes, bad roads, crumbling sidewalks. I mean, those are not things that the feds handle. They're handled by your neighbor, who is your neighbor alderman.
Yeah, no, it's literally where the rubber meets the road, and oftentimes it is the city having to deal with it. And I think like to legislative priorities, I think that's the number one message that New Haven and other communities are sending to the state right now. Is like you're really leaving us out here on our own. The mayor in New Haven has said that the budget deficit could be somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 million, right? And in Hamden, you all are familiar with how difficult balancing a municipal budget in the state of Connecticut can be. And it's sometimes it's like we're living in this like schizophrenic reality where like you like drive down 95 for 45 minutes and like the mill rates are low and there are these huge mansions and yachts and stuff. And it's like, we need help. We need some of those resources. And I think like on maybe the biggest thing that's been requested is this tiered pilot system, right? The payment in lieu of taxes. So you've got cities like Hartford and Bridgeport and New Haven that have all your hospitals, right? They've got your major universities. They've got your health clinics, your psychiatric services. You've got communities, you're dropping off somebody with a drug or a psychiatric issue and leaving them in New Haven. And you know, we're not only dealing with those problems, but we're also losing out on all the tax revenue that comes with those nonprofits taking things off the tax rolls. And in New Haven, I might not get the number right or wrong, but like the Yale University and the hospital alone are getting 146 million, it was last year, in a tax break, right, in their property taxes. It is like enormous. It's enormous.
That makes no sense.
It makes no sense. And the state has this pilot system set up where they're supposed to send money our way to help us, you know, with these huge budget deficits and help compensate for the fact that we're doing all this. And they've never held up their end of the bargain. They've never fully funded it. And so there's this proposal, and there's going to be a public hearing on Tuesday at 11 a.m. It's Senate Bill 873, and it would create a tiered structure for pilot, which would increase pilot payments to cities like New Haven. And this would be just transformative for New Haven.
Now, explain that. I mean, explain, you know, because a lot of times it's, we want to make sure when folks call up to give public hearing, these public comments on like SB 873, what are they asking for? I mean, I know we're asking for a tier structure in the payment in lieu of taxes, but how would that specifically benefit New Haven, just so everybody can understand kind of how that works?
Sure. So this is something that, it's not just New Haven, right? I want to stress that. There were dozens of chief executive officers of municipalities in Connecticut who signed on to a letter that Justin Elicker wrote to the state, including Mayor Lang in Hamden, asking for this change to the pilot program. And for New Haven, it would mean an extra $50 million from the state, right? So that would be huge. And it's
right.
That kind of additional help New Haven needs from its partners. We need more help from the state, and we absolutely need more help from Yale University.
Well, yeah. I mean, how do you give Yale University a $146 million tax break? Like, they so can afford to pay that.
Yeah. No, they really do. And unfortunately it's written into the state constitution. Things in Connecticut need to change in a major way if we're at all serious about equity. If it's not just a word we throw out there in conversation.
Yeah, we have to do something to change we have to have constitutional amendments in Connecticut. I know one of which is this whole voting on the same day thing, this whole thing with, having to have a constitutional amendment to make a Yale University pay, its fair share of property taxes to a city that's suffering financially, and it continues to live and enjoy the benefits of, its services, and then what the residents, on the backs of the residents, what they're doing is that they're, basically subsidizing the tuitions of very wealthy people who are sending their students, their kids to this very wealthy institution, because just imagine what the tuition would be if they were paying their fair share of taxes. I mean, it's really kind of immoral.
It is. It is fundamentally immoral, and for the university to say like, well, hey, we give you guys a voluntary payment of like, what is it, like 12 or 14 million dollars a year, like we're really doing our part. It's just not enough. It's literally a rounding error, and the university is, even if you look at it from the university's perspective, they have spending targets for how much they're supposed to be spending, and they're not even hitting their spending targets. So they've literally have more money than they know what to do with, while the city is having to decide like, well, do we cut our youth programs, right? Do we continue to cut the parks department, which is less than half the size of what it once was? So we're being forced to make these unconscionable choices because you've got the university not doing its share, and then the same thing, right? The governor puts out this budget that doesn't have the pilot program in it, and we have to then say like, well, that would mean if you're not going to help us out, that's going to mean a huge, like, historic tax increase. So these are not choices that people in the 21st century in the wealthiest state in the wealthiest country in the world should be having to make, right? It's just not humane.
It really isn't.
And to your point about the Constitution, I think we need a constitutional initiative process in Connecticut. It is so hard to amend the Constitution, and only the legislature can propose amendments to the Constitution.
Right.
Without a 3/4 majority, which is nearly impossible to do, it takes a minimum of 4 years to amend the Constitution, right? Because for folks who are not familiar with this like arcane process of how the Constitution gets amended, you can either get 75% of the legislature, which means all the Democrats and a good portion of the Republicans, to sign on to something in one legislative session. Then it'll go on the ballot in the next even year. Or you can get a simple majority in one legislature, then have elections for the state House and state Senate, and then get the same simple majority. That's the 4-year route that most things take. So with early voting, it passed in 2019, but they removed absentee balloting from the constitutional amendment. So now this year, I think it's SJ3 is the early voting amendment. That just needs a simple majority. But for no excuse absentee, right? The kind of voting, the option to vote absentee that we all enjoyed, and last year on emergency grounds. If we don't get a huge portion, I think it's 17 Republicans in the House, and I believe it's 3 Republicans in the Senate to sign on to that, then we're going to be talking about it again in 2 years, and we're going to be voting on it in 2024, right? And it won't even be in place. It's unlikely that it'll be in place. It won't be in place for the next presidential election, which is just unconscionable when you think about the fact that we're supposed to be a blue state. We're supposed to be, the folks who care about making voting easy, right? This stuff isn't supposed to be happening here, but it is. It is. And it's the same thing, we make it difficult for other folks, right? If you've been incarcerated or involved in the justice system, and you're on parole, you can't vote. If you're on probation, you can. So it's this really confusing thing, and it can get folks into hot water. If you're on parole and you go try to register to vote, well, then you could be facing additional charges. So it's just crazy. And so we were talking at the beginning of this about folks who are re-entering, who are cut off from their parole officer, who are maybe getting involved with things again that they shouldn't. And you want somebody to reintegrate into society, but you don't want to give them the right to vote? Really? That seems like the craziest thing, right?
Right.
So that's another initiative, and thank goodness that will have a public hearing as well. The date hasn't been announced yet, but that one, for folks who are interested, is House Bill HB 5318. and that was raised by the Government Administration and Elections Committee, who've also raised SJ3 I mentioned for early voting, and the option to vote absentee SJ4. So, there's hopefully going to be one hearing that everyone can go to this year and
Right.
catch all these voting issues, because there's so many where we lag behind where we should. I don't think I'm not sure if the bill for voting rights for incarcerated people has been given a public hearing date yet either.
Which one was that one? The one? Okay.
I'm trying to look that up. But I think that's a conversation we should be having as well, right? Like, there are states like Maine and Vermont here in New England that say, well, even if you're imprisoned, do you forfeit the right to vote? Right? You've committed a felony, but does that disenfranchise you? I'm not sure if that's the kind of punishment that really makes sense, particularly when you have people who are incarcerated who are spending time, learning about society, reading up on how the government works, following the laws. They may be just as well versed as one of us, or maybe in some cases better versed to make a decision. And we look at what happened this year, right, where we had COVID infection rates that were higher than the rest of the state in incarcerated in the carceral system, right? So at sometimes it was like double or triple what the rest of the state was experiencing, and those folks can't say to their legislator, they don't have a legislator, right? Really, in any sense, they can't say like, well, next time around, I'm not going to vote for you because you didn't put any pressure on the governor to change this, right? And when vaccines are being distributed to people who are over 75, it's not really that simple, right? It's not over 75 period. It's over 75 little asterisks, which says like over 75 unless you're incarcerated, because we're still putting you all on hold. So, I think that lack of representation becomes really problematic when you have these life or death forces, staring you in the face.
Right. Totally agree.
I think
and that's a good asterisk to have too, because a lot of folks don't know that over 75, even now we're in another phase of vaccine rollout of over 65. That doesn't include incarcerated people, just so you know. And they have constant outbreaks as well. It's immoral. It's fundamentally immoral. I think, because they're in the care. They are in the care of the state of Connecticut while they're incarcerated, and it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, they are the wards of the state, literally.
Literally. And they don't roll out vaccine for them, and they don't, allow them the right to vote for representation that could advocate for them to be able to get the vaccine and advocate to have better living conditions. So, it's not just losing your freedom, it's losing, I think, constitutional rights that to representation, which is, a constitutional right. It's really more awful than people even believe when folks are incarcerated. I mean, institutionally, they're basically out there.
Yeah.
Awful.
Yeah.
Awful.
And, when you look at like the origins of the, carceral system, right? It was not always necessarily a punitive thing, right? It was supposed to be a way to rehabilitate people. And this is not how we rehabilitate people. It is encouraging to see that Northern is closing.
Yes, thank you, Barbara Fair, for all your hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara Fair. You can't say that enough. That
is
a glimmer of hope in this conversation for sure.
I mean, it just speaks to the fact that community activism, in concert with aldermen like you and Daryl Brackeen, we have he's a big friend of Hammond Action now, to really help you all get done what you need to get done because if you don't get any public comments on SB 873 or House Bill 5318, then that people assume that there's no interest, and I disagree. There's a lot of interest, but there's no marketing. And even, I don't know if you saw what went down last week with Representative Porter during the public hearing last Tuesday, where it's even kind of the whole process of giving public hearing is kind of intimidating and scary. And, people, don't even want to really do it because it takes all day. With the way it is. I mean, I get 3 minutes to talk, but you can have various, state reps that can go on for an hour, holding up the line.
Yeah.
So,
and
I mean,
on Northern closing and all these issues, I want to thank my state senator, Senator Winfield, and Representative
yes.
Porter for everything that they do to advocate. Like you said, in concert with activists and with citizen lobbyists who are trying to take these matters into their own hands. But it does take both in partnership. And I have always found that frustrating. And the times I have been able to go up to Hartford and testify, it's like I really think that the process needs to be fundamentally altered so that there's a part with the general public that's predictable and everyone gets the same time. And then there's a separate part where the legislators or the staff or whoever it is can weigh in and get their hour to talk. But it just doesn't seem fair to me that that's how the process is set up.
I mean, all of them really are, Stephen. I have to say that, even when we go to the Board of Ed meetings, and my child goes to magnet school in New Haven, so I'm involved in both boards. Even that process seems not equitable. I've always said that, you have, impassioned parents. They're reading their statement. They, probably took a lot of time to prepare the statement, and halfway through your time, I'm like, so when do we have like a listening period, where you can read your comment and you can get out what you have to get out. And then we don't try to squeeze it all in at the beginning of a meeting or at an end of a meeting. It just seems so, like you said, it's not very equitable because we never really hear the voices of the people. You want to hear what the problems are. Obviously, we could do written testimony, which we always do, because I always follow it up with written testimony because I always get to that 3-minute time and then it's just too late and I miss it. So, but a lot of people don't have access to do that.
Yeah, no, I think it is all about giving people multiple modes of access that they can rely on, and yeah, if there's an issue with one of those, it may be difficult for someone to follow up with, a PDF of their written testimony when they were just trying to call in over the phone. So right. I definitely think that's something that we need to be thinking about.
I just think it needs to be everywhere. I mean, it's not just Hamden, it's not just New Haven, it's not, with the legislative body up in Hartford, but it's kind of the process just in general is not designed for, I mean, I think people, a lot of, New Haven's making some changes, the Board of Eds and various commissions are making changes. It just still seems that it's not equitable and that, the legislator can kind of go on and on. But, the citizens have to have this little snippet of 3 minutes and then we're cut.
Well, I really will think it's going to be interesting once these meetings start happening again in person, what the government does with Zoom and with these teleconferencing modes, because I think that they've been really helpful for folks where it's like, okay, I can put the meeting on, put my camera down while I'm, cooking dinner. And then when I do get my 3 minutes, like, then it's easier for me to chime in rather than like going, you've got to, get downtown, If you're driving, you got to find a place to park. Then
Childcare.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to find childcare. You've got to set all this stuff up. And I really think, like, as much as it might be hard, because the legislator in me is thinking, like, oh, geez, there's some long nights where if you didn't have the 3-minute limit, like, we'd be here till 1 a.m. But I think, like, it's our duty, right, to hear the public as much as possible. And I think
yes,
I would be in favor of having the in-person hearings again, but also, then saying, like, hey, we're now going to, check in to see who's listening in on Zoom, or who's been able to call in over the phone. For those folks who couldn't make it here in person, it's a real privilege to be able to make it in person. And we should be trying to make the cost as low as possible for folks to be able to make their voices heard. And if calling in is the only way that somebody's able to do it, then I think we are obligated to find a way for them to call in.
Right.
So
it's just, there's so much, there's just, it's, the COVID thing exposed so many things, with our process, our institutions, how we get things done. There's so many places that we work. Like, I work at a place where they emphatically were like, there is no working from home ever. And then the minute COVID came out, everybody stay home. It was hilarious. I was like, okay, so we're all staying home now, right? And I haven't been in my building but one time since March 12th, and everything's fine. We're all still here. And I just think that, in this current, as we kind of, roll slowly back out to, in-person things like public hearings, and I agree with you. I want to see what it's going to be like. I want to see if you're going to still be able to accommodate people who can't get there without physically having to get there and sign in. I've been to some hearings up in Hartford where, I went and signed in at 2:00 and I was there till like 11:30, almost midnight, and my name still wasn't called. I mean, I left,
Right.
because I was like, I can't, it's impossible. But I mean, honestly, if I was home, I could have just left the camera up. Like you said, when my 3 minutes came, it could have been 2 a.m. I don't care. I still would have been able to, deal with my child and, participate in that process. So I hope that we continue to do something along those lines.
Yeah, and if you've got to get up to Hartford and you've got to get there early in the morning in order to sign up, and then you're literally competing with professionals, right? There are lobbyists who are getting paid to stand in line and sign other people up or sign themselves up.
Yes.
It's refreshing that you don't have to deal with that. You can just, log on and sign up for a slot. So I hope that this does continue to be part of the structure for public dialogue in Connecticut. Absolutely.
So what are your specific legislative priorities for Newhallville, for Ward 21?
Well, I think one thing that ties into both of the conversations that we've had about the justice system and about voting is the issue of prison gerrymandering. And that is being litigated in court. Who knows how long it will take for it to be resolved. I think that the state of Connecticut has and the legislature have a deep moral obligation to pass legislation to resolve prison gerrymandering. And that that issue has also been raised. That's Senate Bill 753. And if it wasn't such a moral outrage on its face, right, that we reward communities that host prisons with additional power in our state legislature because they are housing predominantly Black and brown bodies that are being removed from the communities where they live, where they're connected to, where their interests are. So we're diminishing the power of these largely the Black and brown cities in Connecticut, right? If that wasn't like this trafficking in Black bodies that's happening in the present, right? If that wasn't a big enough issue on its own, then you look at Connecticut's disturbing history as like the originator of the Connecticut Compromise, right, in our Constitution. And when you say it like that, like, oh, it's sort of a nice thing. Like, well, we have the House and the Senate and the big states and the small states, and it helped get the Constitution together, right? But it all rested on the 3/5 compromise, and the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. And so again, this idea that, okay, well, we're going to award representation on the basis of the location of Black and brown people who have no representation, no voice, who are in this case almost property of the state, or being employed by for essentially no wages by the state now in Connecticut, versus the same system of slavery and the 3/5 compromise as a reward back then. So I think like we have, and it's like particularly disturbing that this is still a problem here, given our role in historical events.
Is that something?
The scary part is if the legislature doesn't act soon, we're going to be stuck with another round of prison gerrymandered districts until 2031. So they really need to like fast track that as much as they can this session.
And that's Senate Bill 753.
That's Senate Bill 753.
Yes.
So
we talked about that a couple of weeks ago here on our programming, where it's people didn't like most people don't even know what that is, and it's and it just so when I say that there's this cycle of incarceration that starts at kindergarten and the pathway and the pipeline that we do, I mean that is done with intentionality from way back when kids are small. And what we're trying to do is just make sure everybody can see this. We want you to see what's happening, and then how they benefit, how these institutions benefit from incarcerating our bodies, and then incarcerating our bodies and not allow, like you said, not allowing them to have a voice on a ballot, but being counted. Totally incredible.
Yeah, being counted, and then there's the issue of the political representation, right? That you're actually boosting the political representation of these rural and suburban, almost deeply white communities. And then there's the financial, right? The money part of it, right? That this is also weighing on our ECS formulas, and it ties back into the financial conversation we were talking about, the lack of a pilot system. Well, we're also losing out on ECS funding, the educational cost sharing funding that we would otherwise be getting, that these other communities are getting. It really doesn't get more regressive than that. Right. I think like if you were to go up to Hartford and talk about these, talk about things like the pilot system, people would say like, well, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? And I think that people got really up in arms about Senator Looney's proposal to, tax mansions. But it really wasn't a lot of money. If you had $1 million house, you'd be paying an extra $400 a year, right? So compared to the tax burden that people in my ward have, where they could be paying, with their property taxes, with the sales tax eating up a ton of their income, it's just not even close, right? So right. I think we could look at that. Another thing I was talking about the other day is like increasing the fee for bottle redemptions, right? Like Michigan, if you ever look at the can, Michigan's got a 10-cent bottle fee. That could be good for the environment and also good for Connecticut. If the bottles aren't redeemed, the state gets that dime, and if they are redeemed, then all those bottles get recycled. So that would right. I don't know off the top of my head how much money that would raise, but like there are creative ways to raise money, and then there's just simply asking the wealthy to pay. Not even don't like saying pay more, but just paying what they should be paying, right? Like
right.
We still have a carried interest loophole in Connecticut, where if you're not getting taxed on your carried interest, so average people are getting taxed on their wages, right? But if
Right.
you're making tons of money and carrying over the interest with financial instruments, that's not a problem. And the governor, for some reason, just doesn't want to talk about these things. He doesn't even want them to be on the table. And I think we got to get him to understand that that's not okay. That the conversation can't be limited from the get go to continue to disadvantage communities.
Right.
It's
And we
just
can't keep calling, I mean, I was in a meeting with Senator Looney, and they were referring to Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport, Waterbury as needy communities. And I just, it's like you could see smoke coming out of my ears. Just I'm like, they didn't get needy on their own. I mean, like we know how they got here, and how they got here. And now it's like, oh, well, we might be able to sell this because we're part of the pandemic, and everybody got affected by it. So maybe it won't just sound like an ask from a needy community. And I was just like,
we're
stop it.
we're asking for the same resources that other towns enjoy, right? Greenwich is paying, I don't know the exact number, but it's like almost 50% more per pupil than New Haven is. So it's not, and you've got the average town like a Ridgefield or Greenwich is providing significantly more money to their services than we are, right? It's not like it's not just that the need is greater, it's also that the rebel resources is so much less.
Well, we also live in a state that's heavily segregated.
Right.
And nobody wants to talk about that. I mean, why is Greenwich's mill rate so low? Because the property values are so outrageously high. And how did they get so high? Due to segregation and an inflated market based on whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
No one wants to have that ugly discussion. So, you have these urban communities that were created, artificially created. All of it was artificially created based on redlining and resources that were, not allocated and allocated to some and some allocated to none. And then now you fast forward to 2021. Now we're suddenly not suddenly, but we're evolved into needy communities.
Mm-hmm.
No, we didn't.
Yeah, and I think that's where the work of groups like Desegregate Connecticut are so important,
Yes.
right? Like, again, it gets into the weedy, weird stuff that a lot of people, the arcane kind of stuff, a lot of people aren't talking about. But it comes down to our zoning code, right? Where you've got a town like Woodbridge that something like 99.6% of Woodbridge can't have anything but a single family house in it.
Right. Exclusionary zoning.
You've got affordable housing in places like Fairfield, where you've got developers saying, like, we're ready to build affordable housing. We have a law, 83G from the state, that allows us to build affordable housing, whether Fairfield likes it or not, right? Every town is supposed to have at least 10% affordable. And there's an exception to the zoning code to let developments like this come through. And you've got Fairfield tying them up in court for years. So I think things that the state can do to liberalize zoning in these towns is fundamental to changing housing affordability and changing the segregation that we see, like you said, by design, all across the state. So I think that's huge.
Yes.
And, I think in a similar vein, like how the system is set up, I think we need to look at how our voting system is set up. And, one of the reforms that the state ought to be looking at is ranked choice voting, where instead of voting for one candidate, you're voting, who's my first choice, who's my second choice, who's my third choice. Because, we too have people who get into races. Sometimes it's in the primary, right? Hamden had the divided primary with Valerie Horsley, Cabrera, and Sean 4 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. And that was who knows who would have won in a ranked election, right? I think George Cabrera won 40% of the vote, and the other two got roughly 30. Who were of those other two, who are their second choices, right? And so what ranked choice voting does is it takes an election like that and it looks at the candidate who got the least votes. You look at all those voters' second choices, right? And then you add those second choices to the other two. So you can see, once you've added them up, okay, who actually has a majority of support?
Right.
And that's huge for voters, because a voter can say, like, you know what, I'm going to vote for, in Congress this last election, right? You had Justin Paglino running against Rosa DeLauro. You got to choose between, like, Rosa, who is this incredible leader with this incredible history of support for labor, for helping the neediest families, but for whatever reason hasn't signed on to Medicare for all. And then you've got Justin running and saying, like, I am running for Medicare for all. And everybody who voted had to make that choice. Who do I vote for, right? In a ranked election, a voter could say, like, well, you know what? I'm going to put Justin first. I know he's not going to win, but it's a way of signaling my support for this idea, right? And then, and I don't want to say I know he's not going to win. I'm sure he thinks he's going to win. I know Justin, he's great. He works with me on ranked choice voting with our Voter Choice Connecticut ranked choice voting group. But you might think, well, I want to show my support for that and then put Rosa as my second choice. That's the kind of voting that you can do. And so it allows voters to really vote for the candidate that they believe in. And then for candidates, you can get into a race like that if you're Justin, or in a primary, you can say, like, you know what, I'm going to run in my Democratic primary and not be said, oh, well, they're a spoiler, right? They're a Ralph Nader. They're gonna throw the election to the other guy. So we saw that with Oz Griebel when he ran against Ned Lamont and Stefanowski. There are people from the Democrats and the Republicans saying, you've got to get out of this race. You're going to throw the election to Bob Stefanowski. You're going to be a George W. Bush president because of you, kind of thing. You're bad. You're a Ralph Nader. So the interesting thing about this ranked voting system is in the cities where they've done it, right? So places like San Francisco, Oakland, Minneapolis, they're seeing that more women candidates are running and more people of color are running. Because they can run without being, told, well, wait your turn, or, well, you're going to be a spoiler. And they're also winning office at greater rates. So those cities are more likely to have women mayors. They're more likely to have people of color as council people than they were before having a ranked voting system. Of course, that doesn't get into the whole, issue of ballot access.
Right. That's myself. That's what I was going to say. I mean, we could have ranked choice, but then if we are only open from 6 a.m. in the morning to 8 p.m. at night with no early voting, no excuse absentee balloting, no automatic voter registration, then, it's got to be a package deal. I mean, that's the only way I think it works. And then but who really wants that? I mean, if you have, like, okay, all due respect, a 20 or 25, 30-year incumbent, do they really want this? Probably not, because it opens up the access,
Well, that's right now our voter choice group is just looking to get them to study the bill. So there's a study bill 5884, HB 5884. We're trying to get the same committee that's handling all these other voting issues to raise HB 5884. And I'm with you 100%, right? We need all of these reforms, and we need them immediately, right? It will be a crime if we can't get 75% support for the option to vote absentee. And so anybody who's in a Republican district, needs to email their legislator right now and say, I need you to support, my health, my safety, my democratic right to vote in the 21st century, and allow me to vote easily, vote safely, and vote from home with an absentee ballot. And I shouldn't have to sign some form saying that I'm sick, or, I'm going to be out of town all of election day. That's just limiting people from being able to vote. It's wrong.
Right. I mean, it's a deliberate and intentional way to keep elections small and manageable. And like, we see you. This is what I keep saying. I'm like, listen, we see you guys. We see what y'all are doing. This is the oldest trick in the book to keep elections small, and keep them manageable. And then you don't have a lot of complaining, from, people who have to, do whatever it is to make sure ballots are out, make sure people are registered. I mean, last year, we knew that we were going to have, a bigger crowd to come to the polls, in the middle of a pandemic. And we still had a whole host of people. I mean, thousands of people still didn't vote, even though you got it in the mail, you can send the application back. So, where are these people? Why are they not engaged, in the voting process in our state? And I'm like, who are you? I want to knock on their door and say, are you okay? We need you to come out.
Yeah, no, I think they're out there, right?
Yes.
And that's why I think some of those people, they do want, they want to look at other candidates, or they want to look at other issues that maybe aren't being represented in the conversation, and so I think, like, to the ranked voting piece, those communities have higher levels of participation, right? In the same way that, places that have all male voting have higher levels of participation. There's more, it's easier to vote, and there's more interest in the issues.
Yes.
So, and I think, like, to the other thing we were talking about earlier in the conversation, right? If we had a ballot initiative process in Connecticut where you could get 100,000 people to sign a petition saying, hey, put this issue on the ballot, I think that also brings people into the political process,
right?
In a way that the current system with the legislators as the only gatekeepers to ballot questions, right? You just don't get that, So
yeah, like, why can't we just have a statewide referendum? Let's just put a question on there, and we all can check it off, yes or no, and then that just supersedes the Constitution somehow. I don't know. It just got to be an easier way than trying to get 75% of the legislator to agree with it. I mean, I don't, like I said, I don't think you'll ever get it.
Yeah. And I think, looking at the rest of the legislative session, I think, like, there are other things that, if done right, can be good things, right? So the governor has proposed this, joining the Transportation Climate Initiative, which would be a small, I think it's like 8 or 9 cent increase to our gas taxes. But then the idea is that you could funnel that into places that are most harmed by climate change, right? So, like, New Haven has the 11th worst asthma rates in the country. We're right at the junction of these two super highways, and we have all of this pollution. So take some of that gas tax money and funnel it into programs that are going to improve our public transit, reduce the harmful emissions that contribute to smog and climate change, and help improve public health in the communities that need it most. So if that gas tax comes with all of those things, then, sign me up. I'm willing to pay more for gas. We're going to be making investments in the communities that are most impacted. And similarly, we've got marijuana, right? Marijuana's in the governor's budget, but that one doesn't have the frameworks that we need around it to make sure that, we're not just we're not redressing all of the wrongs that came with the quote unquote war on drugs, right? It can't just be, okay, we're going to legalize pot. The state's going to make a bunch of money. The big, like, weird marijuana cultivators that currently exist in the state sanctioned medical program are just going to expand a bunch, right? No, we need to open up economic opportunities to the communities that have been most affected by the war on drugs. And we need to make sure that we are wiping convictions of folks who are ensnared in this, and then we can legalize marijuana. So if we're going to do all these things, we need to do them right.
Well, that was my argument from day one. I said, if they're going to legalize marijuana in the state of Connecticut, the first item of business is to expunge all the records, let all the people go, and go back to like 25 years ago. I know the ACLU is working on a plan to start to, take things off of, we have some legislation to get things off of people's records, because, we cannot continue to, you can't get it. It's hard to get a job. You can't get housing. Some places, it's like, it just kind of holds you hostage. And so if we're going to do any, get all of the records cleared, if you can delete it, get it off their record, let them get their lives back,
Yeah,
while we're making a whole bunch of money.
Right. Dan Malloy used to always talk about the Second Chance Society, and his administration did a ton of great work to start unraveling some of the injustices in the justice system, so to speak. But if we don't have clean slate legislation, and we're releasing folks, but we're handicapping them in a million different ways, then
there's no point.
We're not achieving the kind of equity that we are obligated to do, that we need to do. And I feel like for the fiscally conservative kind of people out there, like, think about all the jobs that are not being created and the economic impacts of oppressing people. It's enormous, right? So I think like it's important to keep that in mind. We talk about regressive zoning, we talk about clean slate policies, like all of these things are fundamentally bad for society morally, and they're also like holding us back and holding people back from realizing their human potential. And then in turn, like we look at Connecticut and the economy kind of like stays flat year after year after year. It's like, well, maybe we ought to look at the connection between all of these things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we are getting close to about an hour. So I'm going to give you the last word. Tell us, what we can look forward to in the Newhallville Ward 21. I'm all excited because I can say I met the alderman.
So one huge issue in New Haven, I'm sure it's the same in Hampden, is the speed of traffic, right? And the average speed of vehicles in the last couple decades has gone up from roughly 25 to over 35 miles an hour. So people are just flat out driving faster. And in our communities, people don't feel safe at all. Every street I walk down, people say, like, when are we getting our speed bump? The city of New Haven approved funding for raised crossings on the Farmington Canal line. So wherever the Farmington Canal line is, you'd have like a big speed table to slow down traffic and also to keep people on the trail safe. So it's good for everybody. If you're exercising or using the trail, you're safer. And if you're in one of these communities where people are just speeding through, it's going to slow down traffic. But it's a federal grant, and Hampden needs to do their part too. So it's a 1 to 4 match. So for every dollar Hampden puts in or New Haven puts in, the federal government puts in 4. So I would put that out there to folks in Hampden who might be listening. We need to get that done so that we can have this awesome protected bike trail and also slow down the crazy speeding that's happening in our communities. And I think there's a bill in the legislature, 5429, that looks at how we can improve pedestrian safety. Like last year in New Haven, we had, I think, 13 people, 12 pedestrians, 1 cyclist, who were hit and killed by vehicles. And 66 in the state of Connecticut. So these speeding vehicles are literally killing people left and right. So that's another one for folks out there to be thinking about as well.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Alderman Winter. I'm so happy to meet you. I think this was a really good conversation. And, even though we're just your neighbor, like you said, there are things that we all can be applying for. I will reach out to Justin Farmer and ask him if Hampden is going to apply for those funds. Because, again, if they're there, we should all be applying, and we have to do our part as well since we're your neighbor.
Well, the funds have already been approved. We just have to fund our portion of it. And so it gets back to all of the budget issues that the state leaves Hampden and New Haven with, right? So, but yes, talk to Justin. I'm sure, he and his bike, the majority whip, would approve of it.
They would definitely approve. Thank you so much for talking with me tonight. And it was such a pleasure to meet
me. Yeah,
you're a totally great. And hopefully you'll come back again. We could talk some more about, as we get into the summer months and they roll out the vaccines and, we kind of sort of wean ourselves back into face-to-face, interactions. I would love to talk more with you and see where we are then.
Absolutely. And the vaccine hotline is now open 7 days a week. for anyone who's
Oh, okay.
interested in calling in. So you can call in on the weekends. I think it's open 7 to 7 most days. And that's 877-918-2224 for anyone 65 and up.
Totally cool.
Yeah.
They're slowly getting to me.
It's coming.
Get to me, I'm going. Oh, all right. Well, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Okay. Thanks, Rhonda. Have a great night.
Take care.
Bye.